welcome to the Refugees International Town Hall for today, World Refugee Day 2024. Greetings from the Refugees International headquarters here in Washington, D.C. We are really pleased that so many of you are joining us this afternoon to hear about the incredible work that Refugees International is doing every day on so many crises and so many issues around the world. I do want to quickly note this event is being recorded, and we'll make it available online later this afternoon. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions, if you have comments, please feel free to use the Q&A function that is embedded in Zoom. You can see that on the bottom of your screen there. There's a little Q&A icon. You can enter questions in that box, and those will go to our team, and then we'll feed those to our speakers throughout the session, and we'll have some time at the end to answer some of those Q&As and to take additional thoughts and questions that may be raised by the discussion today. And anything we can't answer live, we will do our best to follow up with you after. So again, thank you for joining, and thank you particularly to the many supporters of Refugees International who are joining us here today. As you all know, your generosity makes our work possible. As an organization that does not take UN funding, does not take governmental funding, we rely really heavily on the support of people like you to fund the hard-hitting and independent advocacy work that we do. And we're particularly grateful that you're making the time to join us on what is a big day for us every year, World Refugee Day. And we are so excited to share some of what we've been working on this year. As you, I'm sure, understand, this has been a really intensive period for us. We are, seeing historic crises in Gaza and Sudan. We are facing challenges to asylum protections here in the United States. And we're also working to keep a global focus on crises in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Bangladesh, that continue to have a huge human impact, even though they are often out of the global headlines. So I'm really excited and really proud of the work we're doing and proud to share it with you today. One thing I am particularly proud of, and that is really meaningful and important for our team and for the future of our organization, is our work to elevate refugee leadership through the Refugee Fellows Program. And you'll be hearing a little more later from Horia Tafesh, who leads that program for us. We just completed our first cohort of fellows. These were 6 amazing refugee leaders who spent a year as fellows with RI, working in partnership with us, learning from us learning from them, and co-developing, co-creating advocacy initiatives together. We're now actively recruiting our second cohort of refugee fellows, and Horia will have much more to tell you about that a bit later on. A few kind of wins and impacts that I'm proud of that we've had throughout the year, in addition to what you're going to hear about shortly. I traveled in March to Ukraine and took part in a huge national workshop that we helped to co-organize with 16 Ukrainian-led humanitarian organizations who had come together to form the first alliance of humanitarian civil society organizations in Ukraine. And those are a group of organizations that we've been working with for some time, who approached us about a year and a half ago and said, the whole international system has shown up in our country. We feel like we're getting pushed aside. How do we deal with this? And so we've worked with them to lift their voices, to help them to organize their own advocacy that they are now leading with our kind of background support. That has been hugely effective in changing the conversation on national leadership of the aid response in Ukraine. And as a result of some of that work, these organizations formed that alliance. They have really driven a different kind of donor conversation. It has unlocked tens of millions of dollars in new funding already for Ukrainian organizations. And what was wonderful about the conference that I had the privilege of attending was it was truly nationally led. So all of the donors attended, all of the NGOs attended, but they were coming to something that the Ukrainian leaders themselves were convening. And that was a really powerful moment in shifting the dialogue and shifting the power dynamic there. And that's the sort of thing that we were trying to drive in more and more countries. We also had a really notable win just this past week. We've been working for the past year in Costa Rica with a national organization partner called Irka Casabierta to advocate for the rights of asylum seekers, and particularly for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers in Costa Rica. One of the big challenges there was that the Costa Rican government had put in place a restrictive new policy that made it much, much harder for asylum seekers to gain legal work access. And so we, working with our partners at Irka Casabierta, had pushed and advocated, worked with the business community there, worked with civil society leaders there, immigration activists, and engaged directly with the Costa Rican government to push for a reversal of that policy. And we just got news earlier this week that indeed the Costa Rican government has agreed that they will reverse the policy. So that is a really big win that's going to make life a lot better for asylum seekers in Costa Rica. And one thing that I think isn't as widely known as it should be is just how much Costa Rica does to support asylum seekers. In a population of about 6 million people, they have nearly 500,000 asylum seekers, so a huge share of their population. So this is a huge win that will affect lives for a lot of vulnerable displaced people. There's a lot more like that, but I don't want to hold up my colleagues any further. I want you to hear from them, and I know you're here for them for the most part, and rightly so, because that's where the action's happening. So I'm going to turn over now to a few of my colleagues who'll share updates on some of our other advocacy initiatives and the impact that we're having this year. And again, do leave some questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of those as we can in the back half of the town hall today. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kate Brick, the amazing executive director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, to talk about some of the lab's work here in the US.
Thanks, Jeremy, and hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you all. We're going to get started with some of the hot button issues right now here at home. I'm sure, like many of you, we at Refugees International are thinking about the election and how we can best prepare for an outcome that may not be favorable to people seeking protection in the United States. So at the lab, and for those of you who aren't familiar, the lab is an initiative that's housed at Refugees International, and it's co-led with the International Refugee Assistance Project and Refugee Congress. Our mission is to strengthen the movement for the protection and inclusion of people who have been forcibly displaced and are here in the United States. And the lab actually was created as a product of what we saw happen during the Trump administration, which revealed a major gap in capacity of organizations who were working on the ground and didn't have that ability or that funding or that time to advocate for the United States to continue to have a functioning protection program. And that was because we hadn't needed that kind of advocacy capacity in the past, because refugee protection has historically been a bipartisan issue in the United States, with support widely across the American public and across party lines, but that really was upended with the last Trump administration. And unfortunately, as we've all seen, especially in recent weeks, the rhetoric around who's coming to the United States to seek safety now and how they're doing it and the extent to which the US should continue to protect people has become wildly polarized, with the narrative misinformed and increasingly toxic. And so in this environment, it's critical now more than ever for us to show the administration just how much the American public supports the US continuing to welcome people seeking safety. So to do that, we are working with partners to mobilize elected officials at the state and local level from all 50 states to sign a letter to President Biden ahead of the September presidential determination that sets the ceiling each year for refugee admissions for the following fiscal year. We really want the administration to hear loud and clear that communities across the country see welcoming refugees as a priority. And specifically, we want them to strengthen and preserve our resettlement program so that it is well-funded, resilient, and can withstand external pressures, refugee emergencies, and critically, political transitions. So while the ask and the message itself is important, equally important right now is that we're seeing this opportunity to get folks who are at the state and local level engaged with us on this letter. This is an engagement tool that we will use to build this base of support from communities across the country who care about this issue. And so by engaging hundreds of leaders, and in the process of doing that, working with refugee leaders, business leaders, faith leaders, and other influential grass tops individuals who can hold their elected officials accountable, we're building this critical infrastructure of champions that we will go back to in the next administration, whether that's continuing to encourage President Biden to do the right thing on protection or to mobilize in the face of a situation where a protection system is being dismantled. So you can find more information on the Welcoming Refugees campaign and take direct action to support your representatives to sign on by going to welcomingrefugees2025.org. So far, we've had nearly 300 bipartisan elected officials at the state and local level sign on from 45 states. We want to make sure that we have representation from all 50 states by the time the campaign ends at the end of August. And we really want to ensure that there is strong support on both sides of the aisle to show that there really is bipartisan support for people, for continuing to protect people seeking safety nationwide. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to get involved. There are a lot of other ways people can get involved outside of taking action. We're supporting community leaders in writing op-eds, in recording video testimonials, and much more. But we're really hopeful that all of you on the line today will take 5 minutes and reach out to your state and local elected officials to get them to participate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Abdullahi Halaki, who is Senior Advocate for East and Southern Africa. Abdullahi, over to you.
Kate, thank you so much for all the wonderful things that the lab is doing. My name is Abdullahi Halake, and I cover the East and the Horn, as well as the southern part of the African continent. The region is really, if you will, the ground zero of long-standing protracted crises, a new onset of refugees and displacement situation. Some of the refugee situation are as a result of conflict, some are as a result of climate change, but in many cases, the two intersect, and you have people who are being displaced because of climate change and conflict. Simultaneously, countries in this region also, they host as well as generate refugees, and some also act as transit countries for people who are going to other parts of the world. Just to give you an example, Ethiopia has got almost 1 million refugees, but there are certain number of Ethiopian refugees in Kenya, as is elsewhere. Kenya hosts almost over 500,000 refugees. Uganda has almost 1.7 million refugees. But I just want to spend a bit of my time speaking about Sudan, where we've spent almost 15 months now documenting, being in the front line of documenting what is going, what is really one of the largest displacement in the history we have. 9 million people have been displaced, both internally and externally, and these people do need a lot of help. For instance, in May, we traveled to the Egypt-Sudan border, because that is the first wave, or that was when the first wave of refugees from Sudan were trying to leave the country when the conflict broke out mid-April last year. We documented Sudanese-led groups that were providing tremendous amount of support with the least amount of money and expertise that they have in providing shelter, food, and all that they can to some of the refugees. I just want to give you an example of some of the wonderful work that they are doing. They had houses where people, for the first 2 days, they come through, they get food, they get shelter. But some of the stories that we were able to document as well were really difficult stories. That one of them stays with me is the story of Faris, who was not even 2 years old, and he had both kidneys failing. One was operated on when he first came to Egypt, but immediately they were about to return for the second one. The conflict erupted, and he's now stuck. He was stuck at that time in Cairo, and he cannot go back, and he was not with his father. In June of last year, we went to South Sudan. We were some of the few organizations that that arrived very early on at the South Sudan border to document many of the returnees from Sudan, majority of them South Sudanese, something close to 800,000 who are coming in. I think Sudan also might have the dubious distinction of one of the countries where you have genocide going on, just like it was 20 years ago, as well as famine, just like it was in 1984 and 1988. Almost 5 million people are in acute need of food inside Sudan. 9 in 10 people live in conflict-affected areas of Darfur, Kordofan, Al Jazeera, and Khartoum that are in need of food aid. We've got the UN has documented over 141 hunger spots inside Sudan. What has Refugees International done? Collectively with other groups here in DC and in elsewhere, we've managed, last December, after months of advocacy, the United States made an atrocity determination, and it stated that war crimes and crimes against humanity have taken place inside Sudan. In February 2024, the United States appointed a special envoy for Sudan. While these are, positive steps in the right direction, but it doesn't meet the needs and the moment. And as such, Refugees International is continuing to call for sustained high-level diplomatic and political engagement on the Sudanese crisis at the global capitals, as well as at the African Union and regional bodies. We also call for unimpeded humanitarian access to prevent the prolonging of the conflict. People in need, whether there is cessation of hostilities or not, they, by the laws of the war, they have to have access to the humanitarian agencies. As such, belligerent organizations and groups and their affiliates should stop denying humanitarian access. And fundamentally, though, one point that I want to spend a bit of time on is the local Sudanese organizations that are not adequately funded. They have been in the front line. They have been the last mile delivery of humanitarian aid without getting the kind of support that professional, international, and national human rights humanitarian organizations are getting. But they are delivering. They are, getting more bang for their bucks, and without them and the diaspora that is supporting them through various means, we would have seen a far more catastrophic situation. I'll leave by saying, learn more about the Speak Out on Sudan campaign that we ran, and the link will be provided in the chat. And please add your voice to call for action by sharing tweets in the chat, and that will be shared. Over to you, Huri, to give us more on what is going on with the refugee fellow. That is a remarkably important step that Refugees International has embarked on. Huri, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Abdullahi, for this great overview about what is happening in Sudan. I'm Huriya Tafish, and I'm the Director for Refugee Leadership and Partnership at RI. First, I just want to touch upon why RI decided to invest in refugee leadership at the first place. So when we're talking about refugee leadership, our main idea was, when we're talking about really coming up with solutions, as we are at RI solutions driven, if we have to come up with really effective solutions for the refugee crisis anywhere in this world, this solution should be driven by refugee leaders themselves, because those who are closer to the situation would for sure be able to come up with effective solution if the conditions and resources are available. And this is where comes the Refugee International role, to make sure that the resources and the support is really available for the refugee leaders who are already doing this work all over the world. And this is why we launched our first refugee fellows program last year. The first cohort joined us. It was made of 6 amazing refugee leaders from all over the world who are already doing an advocacy work in their own community, but we as RI, we're trying only to support what they're doing to make sure that they got the necessary resources they need moving forward. So we started the first fellowship cohort last year. The fellows were made, they're coming from different countries such as Venezuela, Syria, Iraq. I don't want to forget anyone here, Sudan, Myanmar, and two others. The main mission or idea behind the fellowship was, and how can we support or meet the refugee leaders on their advocacy journey, wherever they are, and make sure that we really, as RI, use our access and our resources to make their advocacy journey smoother. And this is why we based our fellowship on 3 main pillars. The first one is preparedness. For example, we ran a series of almost 9 training sessions about specific areas that refugee leaders themselves have identified to make sure that they get the technical support they need. The second pillar is access. We made sure that our fellows have access to some international forums where refugee governance internationally and regionally are taking place, such as the Global Refugee Forum, COP28, for example. We made sure that we support our leaders to be there. And the third pillar is resourcing and networking. We also tried to connect our refugee fellows with some networking opportunities and other funders. Some of them managed to get some donations through the funders that we connected them through. Nonetheless, we cannot say that we have completed a full perfect fellowship year, but I can say that it was a successful year, a successful start, and we currently are working on accepting, or we actually just closed the application for the second cohort, and we have received almost 900 applications, and we are in the process of trying to choose or select the refugee leaders for the second cohort. And it is one of the hardest things that I have ever to do in my life. We have a great amount of amazing applications that making it harder for us to know how we can really accommodate all these amazing refugee leaders who are doing amazing job and all over the countries. So as I'm saying, 900 applications. Now we are also thinking about moving forward, what should be the case. For next year or for our future plan, we're thinking about how we can increase the number of the fellows spots that we have. Right now we have 6 fellows, but we want to make sure that we have more next year. For sure, it all comes back to funding, but we will make sure that next year we will have more fellows on board. And also we're trying to engage the refugee leaders and the refugee fellows into our longer term strategic plan. So for us, supporting refugee leadership is not like a corner issue that we are working on. It is core element at Refugee International when we're thinking about how we can include the refugee leaders and the concept of always co-creating our advocacy initiatives side by side with refugee leaders. As we did during the interview, we had joint field trip with our fellows, we had joint delegations with our fellows, but we want this to be a core element of what I do. So moving forward, we will keep working to increase the number of the fellows spots that we have for sure, and we will keep working on making sure that this will be not just a corner element in our work, but it is actually a core aspect of what we do. And that's it. Thank you very much. Moving forward to our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Horia. This is Yael Shacher, zooming in from the US-Mexico border. I'm the director for the Americas and Europe at Refugees International. And this is sort of the land of gates and limitations on asylum. And I think it's crucial on the day that we recognize the need for refugee protection and contributions of refugees worldwide, that we talk about immediate opportunities to work to preserve access to asylum and ideally reduce the barriers for people once they are in the United States. As we speak today, the right to seek asylum in the United States is under a grave threat. Last year, the Biden administration implemented a regulation limiting eligibility for asylum at the border, and yet the number of people coming to seek asylum has only increased since. After Congress failed to pass a border enforcement bill this past winter, the administration doubled down on failed deterrence policies, effectively making it impossible to seek asylum after crossing the border, moving us backwards to policies of the Trump administration. Again, I'm calling in from Arizona, where families are being turned away without a chance to seek protection. I spoke this morning to a Mexican mom from Guerrero, returned to Nogales just now. She spent 5 days in CBP custody, was separated from her sister, who was deported in Piedras Negras, which is hundreds of miles away from here. She said she cried, and she told, she cried to the CBP officers and said she feared return to Mexico, but CBP did not interview her about her fear of return, told her to seek asylum in Mexico, which is the country that she fled, and warned her that if she tried to cross again, she would be separated from her children. She does not know what to do now that she's back in Nogales, Sonora, in Mexico. She's stranded here with her 10-month-old and her 7-year-old. And all she knows is that she can't go back to Guerrero. What we need instead is an affirmative vision for humane reception of asylum seekers at the border and in communities across the country. I've been working with members of Congress on legislation to be introduced in the coming weeks that would help the federal government better coordinate reception of newcomers and provide funding to communities to welcome asylum seekers, to help them out of shelter so that they can support themselves and contribute to our communities in the United States. This is related to another effort we've been involved with at RI over the past few months. When people seek asylum in the United States, they want to work, they want to earn a living, they want to support themselves and their families, but currently there's a statutory 180-day waiting period to gain work authorization. That, coupled with barriers to applying for asylum and a work permit and backlogs in processing, mean that most asylum seekers cannot legally work for at least 6 months and often much longer. This is a huge missed opportunity. We are seeing unprecedented labor shortages across industries in the United States, and there are thousands of people who are already here and they want to work as quickly as possible. To draw attention to this issue and urge concrete action, in October, Refugees International partnered with the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Project and the American Immigration Lawyers Association and more than 50 organizational partners across the country to launch our Let Asylum Seekers Work campaign. The goal of the campaign is multifold. We want to educate the public about this issue and how it affects communities nationwide. We want to elevate large, diverse tent of support for it to be resolved, from the business community to state and local elected officials to faith leaders and, critically, people seeking asylum themselves. And also to urge tangible action in Congress, where multiple bills have been introduced to reduce this wait time and improve access to work authorization for asylum seekers. Key to the campaign is coalescing support across our field for the bipartisan House Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act, which would allow people to access work permits 5 months sooner and make asylum seeker work permits continuously valid throughout their entire asylum adjudication process. While we know the prospect of passing anything in Congress is low just now, we see real value in bringing visibility to this issue and to the deep support for a solution into that public conversation. Asylums, to that end, our campaign sets out to amplify and broaden cross-cutting bipartisan support for this bill in the House and on the issue more broadly. The bill highlights the way asylum seekers are valuable members of our communities. They are assets, not burdens. We launched with dozens of endorsements, including the mayor of Boston and other state and local elected officials from Iowa to Colorado, the Bishop of El Paso, and other Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders, business and major industry associations, and more. So far, nearly 2,000 people from 49 states and the District of Columbia have written their members of Congress, urging them to take action, reflecting the broad support for this common sense solution. We have also worked with partners to further emphasize support by releasing a letter to congressional leadership signed by more than 100 businesses and business leaders from across the country. And in the new year, we will be releasing a powerful campaign video. We already actually released that video that is really something to watch. It really emphasizes how faith leaders, impacted community members, asylum seekers themselves, business leaders, and elected leaders are all seeing this as a really crucial answer. We encourage all of you to get involved in this campaign. There'll be a link in the chat to the campaign website, and you can take action now to contact your representative in Congress. And this is all in order to make sure that really asylum seekers are seen, in the narrative about asylum seekers needs to change. We need to see asylum seekers as who they actually are, people seeking safety, who want to support their families and contribute to the American economy, and we should provide them that opportunity. Thanks so much. I'll pass it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Al. I really appreciate it. So moving to the Middle East. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jesse Marks. I'm the senior advocate for the Middle East. For the past 9 months, our team has been raising the alarm and working to both hold the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government to account, while also clearly condemning Hamas's crimes and calling for unconditional release of hostages in Gaza. We are faced with the worsening humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza 9 months on. The crisis has steadily worsened since October, pushing an estimated 2.2 million Palestinians into an increasingly worse life-threatening situation. And neither Israel nor Hamas has shown a willingness to prioritize human life above the war. As a result, all of Gaza is suffering. Refugees International visited Egypt, Jordan, and Jerusalem, both in January and again in May and June, to better understand the impediments to humanitarian aid and access in Gaza. What we learned was deeply troubling. At the top level, the crisis that we are seeing now is a perfect storm of human suffering. Virtually all Palestinians have been forcibly displaced during this war, some of whom have been displaced as many as 7 times. Basic necessities, specifically food and water, inside of Gaza are consistently and dangerously low. People cannot access basic survival items such as food, water, medicine, fuel, and shelter. And Gaza's population have instead of densely packed informal camps. Currently, only 20 to 23% of Gaza is actually livable. The rest remains under forced evacuation orders. Some parts of Gaza have been entirely cut off from food and humanitarian aid. As a result, many people cannot feed themselves and their families due to either a lack of food availability or the inability to afford what little food is available. Palestinians, particularly in the north, told us during our visit that their families could not find food and at the worst times were forced to eat animal feed and weeds. Doctors, Palestinian doctors, and international doctors inside of Gaza told us that there are large growing cases of acute malnutrition across Gaza. As a result, parts of Gaza have slipped into famine, and the risk of famine spreading remains dangerously high. UN agencies have reported that young children are already dying from starvation. In addition to outright starvation deaths, doctors in Gaza told Refugees International that patients are dying of trauma wounds. These are the types of wounds that would normally be survivable in a healthier patient, but due to malnutrition were ultimately fatal. Gaza's medical infrastructure, its hospitals, its clinics, and its healthcare facilities are in rubble. Doctors and healthcare workers face immense challenges just to save lives, often at the risk of their own lives. What little infrastructure that is still operating in Gaza is far beyond the capacity due to limited beds, supplies, medicine, and staff. And we have seen time and time again Israeli attacks hit hospitals, doctors, and healthcare workers in the midst of their service provision. Palestinian doctors told us on many occasions they fear for their lives, but they bravely show up each day to continue saving other lives. Responding to the needs in Gaza requires consistent, predictable, and scalable avenues for delivering and receiving aid. However, no such response is possible due to the consistent impediments and bureaucratic restraints. The humanitarian community continues to face major challenges to delivering life-saving services and assistance at virtually every turn. Typically, the humanitarian community would significantly scale up operations upon receiving multiple reports of potential or ongoing famine conditions, like we have seen, both in the news, which have been acknowledged by groups like USAID and the UN. However, this kind of operation in Gaza has largely been impossible up to this point. Gaza today is the most obstructed humanitarian operating environment in the world. Nowhere else matches Gaza's combination of danger to humanitarian personnel, rapidly changing conflict dynamics, and overlay of internal and external bureaucratic challenges. For a moment in March, it looked like positive movements in humanitarian access would improve the situation inside. For a brief moment, we saw more food come in. Restrictions were momentarily eased. Then Israel's Rafah invasion in late May reversed any gains made during this period and rapidly displaced nearly 1 million people from Rafah. And as a result, the aid flows are again collapsing. But this time, the greatest impact is in the south and central Gaza, not just the north. The trajectory of famine in Gaza is deeply troubling. Coping mechanisms are exhausted, and the population remains highly reliant on aid. And the situation continues to get worse. Palestinian families are skipping meals, or parents are prioritizing food for their children at their own expense. Others told us in other cases that protection challenges, particularly for women and others, are rising as women are looking to trade to sell themselves to raise money to buy food in the market. Deeply, deeply troubling stories that we are hearing. A ceasefire is the only effective way to save lives. The only way. It is impossible to reverse the loss of life and destructive impact of the war on civilians over the past 9 months. With a range of humanitarian responses may temporarily help civilians survive, aid efforts will be wholly impossible to effectively save lives if there is not a ceasefire. I invite you to learn more and to help us spread the word about the situation in Gaza and what must be done. We must find a way to deliver aid. We must find a way to alleviate the famine conditions. We must find a way to save lives. We are sharing a link in the chat to an informative tweet thread from our president, Jeremy, and we invite you to click that thread, read and share. But at the end of the day, remember the people right now who are suffering on the ground. Think about them, pray for them on this day, and continue to hold hope.
Thanks so much, Jesse, for that powerful report. I joined Jesse on the recent trip, and it was really one of the more jarring, I think one of the more jarring research trips that I've done in my career, just in terms of, as Jesse described, the extraordinary level of impediment that aid organizations are facing in Gaza. And so Sarah has just dropped a thread of tweets in the chat that I did a few days ago, talking about what we observed on the famine trajectory. I think there was a little bit of progress, as Jesse described, in March and April. That bought some time, but much of that progress has now been reversed following the Rafah offensive. And so we're very, very nervous about how things are going to evolve over the summer. And fundamentally, this suffering will not end until there is a ceasefire and release of the hostages. And so we are pushing hard and trying to hold all parties and all sides accountable for adherence to international humanitarian law in their actions. We're now going to turn to some questions from the Q&A in the chat. Sarah Sheffer, our Vice President for Communications, has been answering some of those that come in. So if you want to check your own questions, you can also look in the Q&A box in the Answered tab, and you'll see responses from Sarah in some of those. Before we do turn to the questions, I do just want to also mention that this is our 45th anniversary year. And so this World Refugee Day is particularly meaningful for us because 45 years ago, we were just beginning as an organization. It was in a context a little bit like today of a lot of global turmoil, a lot of human mobility. It was at a time when refugees were fleeing Vietnam, seeking protection and safety here in the U.S. Refugees were fleeing from Cambodia into Thailand and other countries in the region, seeking protection there. And those were challenges that, much like the challenges we see today, required solutions that were policy oriented and not just aid oriented. And so, the advocacy work that we do has its roots all the way back 45 years ago in some of those crises, and that showed the importance of advocacy in humanitarian work and brought us to where we are today. We would be deeply appreciative if you would support that work. And so, we have a donation link that we'll put in the chat. I think it may already be in the chat. If you feel moved to support our work by what you're hearing today, we would greatly appreciate a donation. Any size, nothing too big, nothing too small, it all helps. So there is a link in the chat. If you're moved to donate, we would be deeply, deeply appreciative and grateful for that. We'll now turn to a few questions that have come in, and we'll do some consolidating here so that we can get through them in the 20 minutes or so that we have left. I'll first start. There is a question there about what are the greatest areas of need for refugee care. One thing that, and I'll invite if other colleagues want to weigh in with some examples of this. I think one of the things that we try to do here at Refugees International is keep some global attention on the crises that are important but don't necessarily make the headlines all the time. And so you heard from us on Sudan and on Gaza already in this call. Those are crises that get comparatively more attention, but we're also continuing to work and have issued reports this year and are doing work on places like Ethiopia, where even though the war in Tigray has now ended, there is still immense humanitarian need that is not getting the attention it requires. And so we put out a very powerful and important and timely report highlighting needs in Tigray around food security and protection against sexual violence. We also issued a report that Abdullahi helped to lead earlier this year on the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there has been a surging epidemic of sexual violence related to the conflict there. Abdullahi, maybe you could say just a word or two about that. It's a really, really important topic that has not gotten enough global attention.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think, like you mentioned, the ones that we highlighted are some of the most, top line. We don't have a ton of time. That is why we concentrated on some of those ones. But, last early this year, me and my colleague, we went to the DRC in the eastern part, which is not new to the conflict. But what really is shocking is the level of gender-based violence. In a room that is not bigger than any of our bedrooms, 2 or 3 of them, we, by the count of one of my colleague, we are almost 100 people, or at least 100 people. All of them have experienced gender-based violence, not once, but more than once. For majority of the time, there were people who are either younger than me, because remember, these are people who are almost the age of my mom, some of them younger, but the people who are committing that kind of violations are people who are younger than them. They are practically their kids. And within an African community, when somebody as old as that is able and willing to explain to somebody of an opposite gender who they've not only met for 5 minutes, it just shows you the level of perversity. And women are using to get, they are using sexual, they are being exploited within the camps to get, the little supplies that they can get from where they come. Along the way from their homes, they have been sexually violated. Coming into the camp, they have been violated. In the camps that they have been violated, and there is no support system to really help them. We were able to document, we were able to share it with policymakers here, including the French embassy, that is the Security Council's pen holder on DRC at the UN Security Council. So I think it just shows that the DRC might induce certain level of jadedness from the policymakers. But for the people who are living through it, these are everyday situations that they cannot look the other way. And for groups like ourselves, being in that kind of space and be able to highlight such violations and bring it to the policymakers with, relevant policy suggestions are something that is very important, and we take it very seriously. Over to you, Jeremy.
Well, and Abdullahi, maybe we'll stay with you for a moment. We also have a question on durable solutions and what we are doing on durable solutions. And you were recently in Kenya and have worked closely on the implementation of the new refugee law there, which is directly related to that. Maybe you could say a few words on that, and then we'll turn to Huria to talk further about some of her work.
Thank you. I think when we speak about durable solutions, we are speaking of 3 aspects. One, in the case of displacement, return to the home country, or in the case of IDP, return to their home region within that country. The second one is, resettlement in a third country. And the third is reintegration in the country of displacement. So in the case of Kenya, that has had an encampment policy in the 2 refugee camps in the northeast and northwestern of the country. They have passed a new law that will allow an expansion of the camps into settlement areas, which means because of the law and because of the East African community, where 7 countries are a member, as a refugee from Somalia in Kenya, you could potentially travel upon giving up on your refugee status to a place as far as the eastern part of the DRC, which is also a member of the East African community. So I think at the time when we have a very poisonous domestic conversation around refugees, you're seeing some movement in trying to find a solution to the protracted displacement like in Kenya. But again, the proof is in the pudding. We'll try and keep our eyes on it. We will deliver a report next month. Keep glued as we work through the report and share it with you. Over.
Thanks, Abdullahi. Horia, let me turn to you next. We had a question from one of the attendees about what more needs to be done, what more can be done to invest in people and elevate people with lived experience of displacement in humanitarian work.
Sure, thank you, Jeremy. So I can focus here on two main things. The first thing that we have been working on when it comes to people with lived experience is it changing, I can say, a hard-held perception about refugee leadership for almost like decades now, about like a lack of expertise or coming with just emotional trauma to deal with policy work or with advocacy work. So when dealing with this issue, we have a lot to work on countering the negative narrative about what refugee leaders and experience means, or for example, what refugee leaders with lived experience means and what they bring to the table, the added value they bring to the table. This is one of the main aspects that we're trying to make sure that we break through these barriers, to make sure that people or policymakers, governments, international organizations do understand the added value that refugee leaders bring to the table. And the second part of it, which mostly all refugee leaders, I think, would agree on it, is lack of funding. Lack of funding for refugee-led work, lack of funding for refugee expertise have been a very big issue. Globally, I can say, across the whole countries, across all kind of work. And this is also where we at RI, we're trying to figure out what could a solution look like. How could we invest maybe in a solution, which is also, we have another project or initiatives. Right now, we're trying to figure out how could we make sure that we support some sort of localization funding for not only refugee-led organization, local organization and refugee-led organization. We're still in the initial thoughts of how could this happen. At the same time, through the refugee fellowship, and as I mentioned, the big number of applications just shows the big need. And we were the first fellowship which was targeting refugee leaders. So the more we can offer more a fellowship for refugee leaders, the more, like, now we are really limited due to funding to 6 spots. But when I look at applications, I'll be like, I can just now like choose applications for the next 3-4 years. Like this is how hard it is. So actually having more funding to cover more refugee leaders would be amazing. And also at RI, we are in the planning or thinking of how could we make sure that RI become kind of a hub to support refugee leader from across the world through the refugee fellowship program. So yeah, I can say, believe in the refugee experience and fund it, and that would work. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Horia. And just to add a little bit to Huria's insights there. One of the things that is really unique about Refugees International in this space is, as an organization that kind of has one foot in the mainstream humanitarian system, but is not dependent on that system for financing, we can play a pretty unique role here because we have access to a lot of the spaces where key humanitarian decisions get made. But ultimately, we're not seeking the funding in that system for ourselves. We, in fact, don't take any funding from that system so that we can hold it accountable. And that has enabled us to have a different kind of relationship and a different kind of partnership with refugee leaders and with local organizations in crisis countries than is possible for many of our peers. We can engage with refugee leaders as partners, not as competitors. We can engage with partners in Ukraine as partners, not competitors. And often what we hear, just as Horia said, is they want access to humanitarian resources. They are starved for resources. They are not, they are watching these huge funding flows from donors to big name brand NGOs and UN agencies, and trying to be part of that process. And because we are an observer but not a recipient of that kind of funding by design, we can help them to push that system. And we've done that in Ukraine. We've done that in Syria. We're working on finding ways to do that through our refugee leadership work, and looking at that at a micro level in individual countries, but also starting to think about some of the macro level changes and reforms that might be necessary in the wider humanitarian financing architecture in order to really unlock resources at scale for local leadership and for refugee leadership. And I think that is a really unique thing that we are positioned to do by virtue of our role and our ethos and our model as an organization. There was also a question that came in the chat about Mozambique and noting the huge humanitarian crisis that is emerging in Cabo Delgado and asking whether we're doing anything on that. And we are, in fact. We just had a research trip go out to Mozambique with our advocates, Mark Wood and Sarah Miller. And I'm, in fact, editing their report right now. So stay tuned. We'll have a report out on that. Mozambique is one of those crises that has very quietly crept up off the global radar, but now risen to a level of very, very significant displacement. Most of that is internal, so it's not refugees, but it's internally displaced people, still forcibly displaced, still very vulnerable. We will be putting out a report with a range of recommendations around the security and protection of displaced people, as well as how to prioritize some of their needs appropriately, and frankly, also just pushing donors and pushing global leaders to pay more attention to the crisis that's happening in Mozambique. And that's an important value add that we have as RI to be able to, if you will, to walk and chew gum at the same time that we are focused on the big crises that are getting a lot of attention, but we're also trying to generate more attention and focus on the places that are often very bad, but for whatever reason are not getting the attention that they need globally. Another question that has come in on how places with large refugee and displaced populations are struggling with reducing resources as more global crises arise. And this is a major, this is a major challenge we're seeing right now. Global humanitarian resources are have declined. They hit sort of a high watermark in 2022. They dropped precipitously in 2023. We're pushing very hard for them to rise again in 2024. But that is creating really, really difficult trade-offs for humanitarian responders. We've seen this in Sudan, for example, and maybe Abdullahi, you can talk a little bit about what you saw in your work on the Sudan crisis and what we've seen in South Sudan and Chad in terms of the financing shortfalls.
No, thank you so much, Jeremy. I think one of the biggest challenges is you're seeing a record number of people being displaced, and you are simultaneously because of climate change and conflict, but at the same time, you see the levels of funding dropping. In many cases, in the case of Sudan, the Sudan humanitarian plan for this year is not even halfway through funded. Last year wasn't as well. It's the same with, for instance, countries like South Sudan that is already has severe humanitarian crises, not just because of the conflict in Sudan, but because part of South Sudan is submerged because of flooding, and one part is experiencing drought. The same with Chad. If you look all the humanitarian indicators, Chad is already struggling even before the onset of this conflict. They are hosting close to 400,000 refugees from the 20 years ago conflict, where many Darfuris who share the border moved into Chad. As a result, what you're seeing is countries that are already fragile, the countries that are already cannot even support its own citizen. If you look at South Sudan, Central African Republic, as well as Chad, the level of education, the level of people in need of aid is already beyond the control of the government, a huge chunk. In many huge chunk of the areas, humanitarian aid groups practically act as a proto-state. Now, because of the displacement in Sudan, you're seeing the country already stretched, farther stretched, but the humanitarian aid that is usually that bridges the gap is not coming in, either because of the paralysis that you see within the United States Congress, or in the case of the UK, a drop in the funding for the humanitarian aid or even development aid writ large. So I think that is why groups like ourselves are advocating for durable solution to some of these conflict, as well as not just treating some of these crises as just purely humanitarian crises, because you cannot have a humanitarian planning model that is 1 year, sometimes underfunded, to deal with a problem that is protracted. So as a result, we are saying support local humanitarian groups in the case of Sudan, without which these crises would have exploded further. Put a lot of money into their hands. They are small, they are agile, they know their communities, they can move very fleet-footed within their communities, and therefore you do not need the big humanitarian agency bureaucracy that does wonderful job in certain places, but not in others. So that is why you see groups like ourselves supporting refugee-led organizations, displacement group-led organizations that are already doing this job. Why not empower them? Why not give them a fraction of the money that other groups are getting? You are simultaneously getting value for your money. You are empowering the people in the front line who knows where the shoe pinches. Then I think that is a way to take care of the ever so declining humanitarian funding. Over.
Thanks, Abdullahi. Before we wrap up, I want to turn to Kate Brick for our last few minutes. There's a question that came through on what more can be done to improve the quality of welcoming of newcomers here in the United States, and in particular to make sure that there is ample refugee participation in how we welcome newcomers to communities here in the U.S. And that has been a huge priority for the lab, and it's really, in fact, core to the whole kind of design of the lab. And Kate, maybe you could speak to some of that work before we close.
Sure. I think the good news is there has really been a huge increase in the ways that people with lived experience have been getting involved in the policies and the priorities of how localities are welcoming and how states are welcoming through many different ways. We've seen just a huge increase over the last several years of cities across the United States that have actually developed welcoming strategies, from Columbus, Ohio, to Portland, Maine, to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where people with lived experience are actually brought in to advise what that plan should be and how a city should be thinking about welcoming people who are from other places and the kinds of needs that they have, whether it be around access to housing or language access, or just having an office in city government whose entire job it is to think about what are the needs of people who come to the United States from somewhere else. At the state level, there have actually been several states that have advisory boards of people who've lived, either refugees or refugees and immigrants jointly, who are advising the governor's office on that statewide policy. And that's something that we really encourage. At the lab and the work that we do, we work in several states across the country to advance a welcoming agenda. And in those states, we work closely with partners there to make sure that there's a really intentional process for how those policy priorities are set. And that is done through listening sessions and through outreach and direct community engagement with people who have lived experience and for whom these policies directly impact. And so there's a lot more work to be done, but I think there's a lot of momentum to build on. And if anyone is interested in learning more of how that's happening on the ground across communities, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks for that, Kate. Yeah, and that that ethos of centering on the voices and the priorities of refugees really is core to what we do in the lab and what we try to do throughout our work here at Refugees International. We are at time. The hour has gone quickly. We are, again, so appreciative of all of you joining us. Yeah, it looks like about 100 people have stayed on. That's where we started, so we didn't have drop-off. So thank you for that, and I think that speaks to the power of the presentations and the insights that you've heard from our advocates here today. Again, we're really grateful for the support we receive from all of you. For those of you who are able to support our work, we would really appreciate a donation. Now would be wonderful, end of the year, anytime that works for you. But we are trying to make a really significant fundraising push here around our 45th anniversary. And so if you have been moved and inspired and felt some hope for a better future based on what you've heard from our advocates here today, we would greatly appreciate you supporting us with a donation. But there are other ways you can help too, and we want you to use your voices in order to show that there is support both in the US and globally for a welcoming world, for supporting refugees and displaced people. And so we hope that you will also be active and vocal in your communities, wherever those may be, in support of refugees and the mission and the priorities that you've heard about here today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your engagement and your support.